middle of the day, late morning presentation on the 5 Fs of Flagstaff. Well, many of us are familiar with the 5 Cs of Arizona, the elements that ignited the state's economy and ultimately led to the growth and prosperity of our communities: copper, cattle, cotton, citrus, and climate. That might work for 2/3 of Arizona, but only if you use some creative thinking can you apply this concept to the northern third of the state. Let me offer a new take on the 5 Cs and present to you the 5 Fs of Flagstaff: farming, forests, freight trains, females, and foreigners, all of which had a dramatic and direct effect on our mountain town's social makeup and economic development. Let's look at farming. Farmers and sheep and cattle ranchers were instrumental to Flagstaff's early growth. The US government made it relatively easy to occupy and essentially resettle traditional indigenous territory through land giveaways provided by the Federal Homestead Act of 1862. With local indigenous groups ordered by the government to stay put on reservation lands by the 1880s, northern Arizona lay open for a mostly Anglo land grab invasion. Many folks arriving in Flagstaff during those early years took up acreage, thanks to the Homestead Act, and put in a crop or two and tried their hand at raising sheep and cattle in a high elevation, semi-arid country. Pueblo people, such as the Hopi, have been growing strains of corn, beans, and squash adapted to limited precipitation and a short growing season for thousands of years in the Southwest. From the late 19th through the early 20th centuries, Anglo farmers in Arizona's Northland found success in growing hay, potatoes, pinto beans, corn, and small grains such as barley, oats, rye, and some hard wheat varieties. Potatoes and other root crops and cole crops such as cabbage, broccoli, and kale all did well in Flagstaff's high elevation with its finicky seasonal rain and snowfall. Farmers found that potatoes in particular grew extremely well. Pinto beans yielded a profitable crop grown at a slightly lower elevation to the northeast of Flagstaff in Doney Park. The major stock raising area in northern Arizona was enormous. Between Ash Fork to the west, the New Mexico Territory to the east, Grand Canyon to the north, and the Mogollon Rim to the south. The industry has a long history, starting in the mid-1500s when the Spanish introduced domestic sheep and goats to the Southwest's Pueblo and Navajo people. These groups and others used the wool for blankets and clothing, and the meat as an addition to their diverse diet. Though rancher homesteaders brought in small herds of under 100 animals during the 1870s, completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in the early 1880s opened the national market and encouraged stockmen to establish large ranches. Sheep and cattle could then be moved to eastern markets easily via rail. During those early settlement days, both individual families and large corporations owned sheep and cattle outfits. The corporations, often with headquarters on the faraway East Coast, invested heavily during those early days in some of the better known cattle ranches, such as the Arizona Cattle Company, the A1, and the Aztec Land and Cattle Company, the Hash Knife. Ranches managed by the Clark, Daggs, Campbell, Babbitt, Nickelball, and Black families during the 1880s were among those who helped jumpstart the Flagstaff economy and put the region on the map as a major stock producer. Forests. Perhaps you've heard that northern Arizona is home to the largest contiguous ponderosa pine forest in the world. Imagine what that might have looked like in the early 1880s. Imagine what that might have looked like through the eyes of newcomer industrialist Ed Eyre and his associate Matt Reardon. A number of you likely know the Reardon family story. Edward Eyre of Chicago brings in sawmill machinery via train, constructs a sawmill, hires Dennis Matthew Reardon as manager, sells to the Reardon family, and brothers Tim and Mike Reardon monopolized the timber industry for decades. It may be worth mentioning that when Eyre's top Midwestern construction manager, Henry Van Zallinger, arrived to build the sawmill, his first impression of Flagstaff was not glowing. In a letter to Eyre, he states, "I am somewhat disappointed in the general look of things, and felt that the local workforce was shoddy and shiftless, ruthless and lazy, and that the local riffraff would contaminate the workplace with various diseases." Remember, this was the early 1880s, and those early settlers were overwhelmingly Anglo, according to available census data. The actual backbone of the timber industry was the ethnic and racially diverse lumberjacks and mill employees, none of whom lived in 13,000 square foot mansions, but all of whom were citizens of Flagstaff and contributors to the local economy. With this labor force, the timber industry expanded and thrived in Flagstaff, and somehow powered through episodes of drought, increased government regulation and transportation costs, labor strikes, and the Depression. New lumber companies emerged, including the Louisiana-based Katy Lumber Company, which brought along its own workforce. African-American families keen to leave the oppressive life of the Jim Crow South during the Great Migration and settle in Flagstaff, where wages were higher and life was perhaps a little better. Katy Lumber also employed Native American laborers for some of the most menial jobs, like gathering limbs and brush from felled trees for burn piles once logs were loaded and taken to the sawmill. After World War II, sawmill operations shifted gears to supply the demand for post-war housing and keep up with manufacturing new types of forest products. No longer were lumber companies supplying the entire workforce in the mill and in the forest. Independent outfits, such as Gaz Brothers Logging and Trucking Company, contracted to build roads and cut, load, and transport logs to the lumber mills. Mario, Gregory, and Pete Vasquez, and ultimately Mario's sons, took their father Tranquilino's woodcutting business to a higher level upon returning from World War II service in 1946, along with two sponsored Mexican men and Hosea Irving, an African-American logger who migrated to Flagstaff from the South right after 1950. The family won large timber cutting contracts from the Peaks North, Williams West, and the Happy Jack Clintswell area south. All was not pretty in paradise, however. Big timber interests decimated the forest. In response to local timber companies' unchecked logging practices, government officials created conservation districts surrounding Flagstaff, especially in higher elevation areas. They established forest reserves starting in the early 1890s. But by then, timber moguls had been cutting down old growth for a decade. The government divided forest lands by odd and even numbered sections, the odd being conveyed to the railroad, while the even were included in the forest reserve system. Land management was challenging until after 1900, when the feds consolidated land ownership to the United States. Congress established the U.S. Forest Service in 1905 to manage timber resources for the benefit of the entire nation. Investors in the local timber industry profited from our forest lands for nearly 100 years. But even early on, public lands also provided year-round recreation for fishing, sport hunting, camping, skiing, sledding, ice skating, hiking, and exploring via horseback. Rentals of snow sports equipment and stores specializing in outdoor camping, hunting, and other recreation gear began appearing in Flagstaff during the 1930s. Students formed recreation clubs at the Arizona State Teachers College, now Northern Arizona University, for the pursuit of all forms of outdoor entertainment, and the college rented the equipment needed. A group of skiing enthusiasts, with the aid of the U.S. Forest Service, developed the first alpine ski area in the 1930s, called Camp Townsend Skiway, east of Flagstaff. The venture was short-lived and closed in 1935 after a skier fatality. Local skiers then developed yet another downhill area at the base of the San Francisco Peaks, the Ski and Spur, pictured here. They moved the operation further up the mountain, naming it Arizona Snow Bowl. According to a recent statistic, this attraction today generates approximately 700 jobs and brings in a reported $58 million to the local economy. The owners of Arizona Snow Bowl have extended the skiing season in the last few years, snow or no snow, by using reclaimed wastewater to create artificial snow. Not everyone, however, is supportive of recreational skiing on the peaks. American Indian groups view private industry using wastewater to make snow for the ski area as a desecration of sacred sites. 22 indigenous groups honor and respect the San Francisco Peaks. Of those, 11 tribes see the peaks as culturally or spiritually significant. Hopi and Navajo people, in particular, revere the peaks as indispensable to their religious life. Think about that next time you go skiing. Freight trains. Transcontinental rail transport, above all, had the greatest impact on new settlement and Flagstaff's burgeoning marketplace and provided easy market access. The Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, the Santa Fe Railroad, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and many short lines built by timber companies to access timber resources have all rolled through Flagstaff in the past 140 years. But this came at a price for indigenous people. By running railroads through reservation lands, the government broke treaties. and compromise traditional ways of life. Navajo men who were not willing to fight government-backed corporations accepted offers of work laying rails. By the 1940s, the Santa Fe regularly employed Navajo steel gangs to lay track and maintain the rail beds throughout the western United States. The railroad quickly recognized the high productivity and safety record of the all-Navajo labor gangs and preferred this work group over all others. Burlington, northern Santa Fe today employs several hundred workers from the Navajo Nation. To be a member of the steel gangs has always been a thing of pride and remains a generational legacy. Raymond Yazzie was a second-generation rail spiker in the 1990s who enjoyed traveling for work with the railroad. And I quote, "The pay is good and you get to see the country. And it's not so hard on your back now. It used to be hard work in the old days when my father started." The railroad was a primary employer for Japanese and Mexican immigrants, African Americans seeking refuge from the Jim Crow South, and Native Americans. During World War II, the US military established the Navajo Ordnance Depot, 10 miles west of Flagstaff. Over 2,000 Native Americans were employed at the depot, and unloading and loading ordnance from rail cars was one of their principal jobs. Navajo and Hopi families gladly relocated from the reservation as the work offered a steady stream of income for families struggling to live in a wage-earning economy. And I quote from John Westerland's book, Arizona's War Town. Navajos came to Belmont because life on the reservation had been especially difficult during the Great Depression. Believing the erosion and plant cover problems stemmed from overgrazing and lack of range control, the US government ordered severe cutbacks in the number of sheep and goats on the reservation. The Navajo tribe complied, and the tribal council sensed a German threat. The council was disdainful of Nazi concepts of racial superiority. "We and the 50,000 people we represent stand ready to aid and defend our government and pledge our loyalty to the system which recognizes minority rights and a way of life that has placed us among the greatest people of our race." The railroad is tied directly to the success of Flagstaff and is the link between the region and the rest of the nation. A sawmill for the building construction trade. The sawmills supported the mercantile business and the war effort. It provided jobs for immigrants and ultimately helped drive the tourism industry. Shifting gears, we're going to talk about females now. Women contributed to Flagstaff's success during the early years of the town in so many ways, some less pleasant than others. The picture we conjure in our minds when we think of the rowdier side of any frontier settlement in the American West is this: dusty or muddy streets, a row of slapped together wooden false front buildings, horses and mules lazily standing at hitching posts, proud townsfolk staring at the camera. On the seedier side of life, new towns nearly always had at least one drinking establishment, often several. Comes with the territory, right? Flagstaff saloon owners gave the people what they wanted: cold beer, a shot of whiskey, a place to play some cards. They also offered women as entertainers, dancers, singers, and sex workers. Early Flagstaff hosted a number of saloon dance halls and gaming establishments along the rail line in what was called Old Town. In 1881, one Flagstaff dance hall alone contributed $100 a month to the county's revenue base, according to an early newspaper article. That's a bit over $2,500 today. When the business district moved east a few years later to the present location of downtown Flagstaff, and as the town grew, the south side of the railroad tracks became the red light district. The work was rough, to say the least. The hours long, the pay never enough, the conditions unsanitary and generally deplorable. Yet some male townspeople felt that the business of prostitution was a legitimate and social necessity. City Council thought otherwise and attempted to quash the brothel business by imposing high taxes on the establishments and ordinances on working women. Upon his election as mayor in 1908, Benjamin Doney not only lifted these restrictive ordinances, he expanded the red light district to a 10-block area south of the tracks. But turning to a more morally acceptable profession, early educators in Flagstaff tended to be women. Eva Marshall was Flagstaff's first school teacher, and Flagstaff has an elementary school named after her. Her celebrity is mentioned in the 1913 publication Who's Who in Arizona, and I quote from that publication. "She is generally recognized as one of the most public-spirited women in the state, and it was she who held the first temperance meeting in the northern part of the state, managed the first 4th of July celebration in that section, and assisted in organizing the first literary society." When NAU in 1899 as the Arizona Normal School, the first 4 graduates were women, all of whom aspired to become teachers. Catherine Hickman was one of the founders of Flagstaff Head Start in the mid-1960s. She selflessly devoted her life to the education of underprivileged children with the hope that they would grow up to become contributing members of the local community. Ms. Hickman's portrait is part of a mural on the side of the Murdoch Center, a community meeting space located in the Southside neighborhood of Flagstaff. Many women of lesser means found employment in domestic labor for the rich. Families such as the Reardons and the Babbitts hired nannies, housekeepers, and cooks. Employers sometimes offered room and board with these positions. Hopi and Navajo women worked as servants as well in a number of households. Florine Sewestowa was a Hopi woman and a domestic who, upon working for Joseph and Viola Babbitt for years during the 40s and the 50s, retained a close friendship with the Babbitt family after her retirement. Mary Durr, at the young age of 15, was in the service of Michael and Elizabeth Reardon, caring for their children during the 1910s. The family even took her on vacation with them. And then there were Cassie Smith Lane and her daughters, who also worked for the Reardon family later on during the Depression years. Cassie's family, however, was treated a bit differently. During a Reardon Mansion tour the family took in the 1980s, Cassie's grandson remembers a story told to him by his Aunt Essie about a post-dinner party cleanup at the mansion. And I quote from a recent oral history. One of the Reardons that was over the servants used to count all the silver, count all the silverware, and all the trinkets, and all the rings that held all the napkins, the linen napkins, to make sure that everything was accounted for and in place. And Essie says, Mrs. Reardon was so busy counting all them linens and all them forks and stuff, she wasn't paying no attention to the meat we was taking. And she'd go, well, the cook that was back there, one of the main cooks, he used to give it to us. He say, this is gonna go bad, you know, so you need to take. And so he'd give it to us after all the banquets and stuff. They'd have all this food and we'd take it and we'd all eat good. Mary Hart, as matron of the Coconino County Hospital for the Indigent during the 1920s and 1930s, oversaw daily operations at the facility, managed staff, and took care of patients, all while raising 12 children. During the early 1930s, the county employed Lucille Bergen as a nurse at the hospital, though she had no formal nursing credentials or training. In a 1975 interview, she recalled the job was at times trying and a test of patience, but it paid well. I got $60 a month and room and board. You couldn't beat it much. It was good more money in the Depression. It wasn't all that bad, and really a pretty good job. We had good days and bad days, and we tried to make it fun and get as much out of life as we could. The county also hired a flunky or laborer to clean the building and do menial work. This job was often given to women. Employed women as office clerical workers and as mill laborers after male workers left their jobs to join the armed services during World War II. We've come to foreigners. Chinese, Mexican, Basque, and other European immigrants all significantly contributed to the development of labor, commerce, and agriculture in Flagstaff. The Nickelball family arrived in Flagstaff from Germany during the late 1880s. They homesteaded land in Hart Prairie on the northwest side of the San Francisco Peaks, very successfully farming and ranching for half the year, then relocating to town for the long winter months. Today, the family's ranch is the oldest continuously operated outfit in Hart Prairie. K.J. Knackard and his extended family found their way to Flagstaff in the 1910s from Syria and opened a dry goods business called the New York Store. They also purchased property on the south side of the railroad tracks and opened a popular tourist motor court along the original path of Route 66. It still exists today. KJ's brother Elias established the first wholesale liquor business in Flagstaff in 1919. Duties for running the business were shared with the extended family. The picture on the left shows one of KJ Knackard's sons, Fred, who still remains active in the business. Though Knackard Beverage no longer is distributing alcohol, they sure keep the Flagstaff community supplied with plenty of Pepsi products. Hard rock miner Fernando Zanzucchi emigrated from Italy in 1907. and landed initially in Colorado to work in the silver and gold fields, then moved on to the copper mines in Jerome, Arizona. As mining jobs became scarce in the 1920s, he and his family purchased a dairy in Flagstaff. Ferdinando had a love for shortwave radio, but the hobby led to trouble in 1941. Weeks before the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, Ferdinando caught wind of the forthcoming attack through radio from other Italian shortwave operators. He had mentioned the imminent attack to various people in the community weeks before the occurrence. It was shortly after the attack that officers from the US government came to call on him at the dairy. Ferdinando left with the officials and was placed in an internment camp in El Paso, Texas. There he stayed for approximately 1 year, along with mainly German-American immigrants who were also interned at the camp. Basque and Mexican stonemasons made their distinctive mark on the built environment. Itinerant Chinese laborers built the railroad, and Chinese families wanting to make Flagstaff home and be part of the community established markets, restaurants, and other businesses. Wong Jun and his large family bought the American Laundry in the 1910s from a previous owner and sought out Mexican women to work alongside his children in the family business. He eventually sold the laundry to the Montoya family. Immigrant timber workers from Northern Europe and Mexico and African Americans from Louisiana harvested trees, transported logs via rail, and fashioned the raw material into lumber at the mills. Alongside the first people here, the Hopi and Navajo and other indigenous groups, they washed clothes, fed the community, cared for other people's children. They constructed roads, dams, commercial buildings and houses, owned stores, hotels, restaurants, and taverns. Flagstaff has gotten where it is today, thanks to this crucial labor and business pool. Each member of this community helped make Flagstaff what it is today, and they continue to make this place unique and diverse and accepting of us all. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Jill. Quick apology. We had some technical difficulties on the back end, so I'm so sorry to anyone who had to join late, but we are recording this and we will send out the full recording after it's over so that you can watch the whole thing if you didn't get to see the beginning. So now I have some questions from the chat already. If you have other questions, you can throw them in there and we will try to get to everything that we can. Let's see, Jill, let's start with an easy one. Carol asked about the train whistle ordinance that went into effect since she has moved away. So yes, Carol, you can no longer blow the horn in town. Jill, do you know the details of that?
Except, Carol, if you live on the east side of Flagstaff like I do, we had, I kid you not, the train was going off. There's an electronic horn at the Steves crossing and at the Fanning crossing that goes off. But then the engineers are also allowed to blow the train horn, the locomotive horn, if there's a hazard in the track or something. And by golly, there must have been several hazards in the track this morning because you don't even need an alarm clock if you live on the east side of Flagstaff. I don't know the ins and outs of the downtown. I know that it was something that the community was really up in arms about for a very long time. It took them a long time to get the horns silenced in the historic district. basically is what it is.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. I loved them when I was there, and it was hard to get used to in the very beginning, but then after a while, I just,
I don't know, man. I've been here for 23 years and I still am not used to it.
Jill, do you want to unshare your screen in case people want to show themselves? If you would like to show your video, you are welcome to now. You don't have to. Stay muted unless you do have a question or a comment, just because of background noise. I'll jump to another question from the chat. So the lumber industry, another one from Carol, is the lumber industry still a significant part of the economy today?
I would say no. The lumber mills closed down in the late 1980s, I believe. There was a big shift from, of course, being able to cut old growth and using that. And then with increased government regulation and environmental protections for species, there was that shift. You saw the slide that I had of the log truck with the really, really small kind of diameter trees. Those were going to a mill in Snowflake to be turned into pulp. And pulp is used for other types of forest products like plywood and what is it? It's CS strand board, CSB for the building trades. But there is still right now, as far as like the significance of anything that is done with a timber industry, it's mostly for wildland fire protection, where they're doing a lot of thinning right now, so that the next fire that comes through, kind of like the museum fire from last summer, doesn't torch the entire city.
And in that vein, Shelley wants to know, were there any concerns about water usage in the late 19th century, particularly given the growth in timber and agriculture? Have you seen anything about that?
No. You know, with climate change, water resources have changed quite a bit. When settlement first occurred, or I like to call it resettlement, because there were people that were living here before Anglos came here, there were a number of springs in the Flagstaff area. And I think that monsoon season was pretty predictable, and the winter season had crazy amount of snow. You know, there were drought years, because that's been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? But I think that it was pretty plentiful. They tapped into a spring that was above, it's a series of springs above what's called Old Town. They were able to, at an early time period, channel water from the inner basin up in the peaks through a wooden pipeline. And I think that, and people were able to drill wells and such, but I also don't think that people were really utilizing water like we do today. People weren't, they weren't sprinkling their lawns, and they were still dry farming. Irrigation wasn't really a thing here so much. They were pretty much reliant upon what was falling from the sky.
Sure. Tom had a question about the Homestead Act. Did you have to be a U.S. citizen to claim land?
Yes, I believe so. Don't quote me on that. I should know this.
We'll look it up.
Yes, I'm pretty sure you had to.
And then Carol had a question about Ben Doney. What did the townspeople think about his plan for expanding the red light district?
I think he had like a bittersweet support group behind him. I mean, he was really off on left field on a lot of different things. We have a small exhibit in his original homestead cabin on the grounds at Pioneer Museum, which actually is open now, even though the main museum is closed, but the Doney cabin is open on Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 5. And you can read more about his escapades in there as well.
And then Mary had a question, how can you mention women without mentioning Mary Russell Farrell Colton, which I'll throw in. She has a whole museum. So we're definitely not talking about her in Flagstaff.
You know, you can't talk about everybody all of the time. That, you know, you try to pick out some interesting stories and kind of focus on that. The Smith-Clark family was kind of a new addition. I just spent probably over, I want to say 25 hours transcribing an oral history that I did with Wayne Jones, whom many of you who live in Flagstaff would know him from Bash's'. He's a Bash's' store manager, and he has really, really deep roots in Flagstaff. Interestingly, matrilineal roots in Flagstaff since the mid-1920s. And so I really, really wanted to talk about his family in that too. So sorry, Mary Russell Farrell Colton. You'll have your day in the limelight sometime else.
And another question from the chat, what about NAU? When did that seriously start impacting the economy in Flagstaff and changing the footprint of the town?
You know, the name of the Arizona State Teachers College changed, or the normal school changed so many times. I would imagine that by the end of World War II, when the troops were all coming home and people were able to go back to school, I bet you that's when it really kind of jump started and started really affecting the economy then.
Great. Other questions? If you want to unmute and jump in, you're welcome to, or put them in the chat. Do you plan any programs on the significance of Native Americans in Flagstaff?
That's a good one. You want to help?
Sure, yeah. We are working on some. Oh, do you want to help with the research? Or do you want me to?
The question, the person who put the question in the chat box,
Yeah,
you know, I am all open to any kind of collaboration for that too. We are redoing the upstairs exhibits in the museum. So the pandemic has been a little bit of a boon for us because it's given us the opportunity to be able to kind of rip things apart and kind of start over again. And that indigenous story is going to be peppered throughout that exhibit. So we don't want to tread on what Museum of Northern Arizona does necessarily, because they do it really, really well. But what we would like to do is try to kind of connect some of those pieces between what they do there and what we do here, because it is really important.
Other questions, if you want to jump in or type them?
You can also, if there's up that either you're shy about being in a Zoom environment or it comes to you later, you're absolutely email me. And you can get my email address from our website. And it's just the first letter of my name and my full last name.
I'll type it in here.
Sensitive. Sasha will put it in the chat box if any of you want to note it down and talk to me, or call me up. You know, I have lots of time for everybody. It's a big part of my job to be available to the local community and the outside community as well, to try to help you answer some questions, or maybe just have a discussion on what we've talked about here today.
I have a question for you, Jill.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you had some kind of
special training as far as your voice for this kind of presentation. History can usually be pretty dry, but I like the way you just have a lot of different inflections you use. But have you had a lot of experience talking about history where you've really varied your voice a lot? It was all interesting, and you could tell exactly when you were changing. We just didn't.
The quote from Wayne Jones is like, I really wanted to try and get that out of the oral history recording, but I'm just kind of like, I didn't want to erase the entire thing. It's like, how do I do this? I don't know how to do this. But anyway, to answer your question, I had my first and only child when I turned 40, and I used to read to my son. I read to him every night for the first 10 years of his life. And in order to make the stories come alive, I would change my voice for every single character. And I think I just kind of like,
lucky.
so I thought, instead of just, I was reading, you guys. I mean, I can't just like ad lib this stuff because this is how I talk. And I don't think you want to hear that. And we'd still be in the presentation. So I need the paper to kind of keep me in line, but I can also bring some stylistical kind of bling to the presentation too. So that's where that came from.
You did a great job.
Well, thanks. I have a lot of different voices.
Well, that'll keep us all wanting to come back. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Jill, you are a great public speaker. Any last questions before we sign off for the day? Well, thank you so much for joining us. Again, sorry about the problems, but we will send this out to you so you can rewatch it, and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel, I believe, so you can share it with friends as well. And we hope to see you in the future at other events. Thanks for coming.